Number 10. Flying Tiger Line Flight 739. A four-engine Lockheed Super Constellation leaves Guam on March 16, 1962, carrying 107 people, most of them U.S. Army personnel headed towards South Vietnam. Hours later, over the Western Pacific, it is gone. No distress call, no confirmed wreckage, no bodies. That is why this case still matters. A large military charter flight vanished on a known route, and the record still cannot close the gap cleanly. The aircraft was operated by Flying Tiger Line as Flight 739. After departing Travis Air Force Base in California, it stopped in Honolulu, Wake Island, and Guam before continuing toward Clark Air Base in the Philippines. The last confirmed radio contact came not long after takeoff from Guam. Then the chain breaks. U.S. search forces swept a huge area of ocean in one of the largest Pacific air-sea searches of its time. Still nothing conclusive was found. When a plane disappears without debris, investigators lose the one thing that usually turns theory into evidence. One detail kept the story alive. A Liberian tanker, the T.L. Lanzon, reported seeing a bright flash or possible explosion in the sky around the time Flight 739 would have been nearby. That sounds decisive. It isn't. The sighting could point to sabotage, structural failure, or an onboard fire. It could also be unrelated. Without wreckage, there was no way to test any of it. The mainstream view is that the aircraft was lost over the Pacific for reasons that cannot be determined with certainty. A harder reading is that long-range over-water flight in 1962 still depended on navigation, radio timing, weather judgment, and mechanical trust. One violent failure in the wrong patch of ocean could erase almost the whole event. The fringe version treats the flash as proof of a bomb or secret attack, but proof is exactly what this case never produced. Number 9. Star Tiger. In January 1948, an Avro Tudor 4 called Star Tiger is crossing the Atlantic toward Bermuda with 31 people on board. Then it disappears so completely that even now, the most honest answer is still incomplete. The scale is smaller than Flight 739, but the tension is the same. Once the evidence falls into the ocean, certainty falls with it. Star Tiger was operated by British South American Airways. On January 30th, 1948, it left Santa Maria in the Azores for Bermuda after earlier legs from Europe. Conditions were not ideal. The aircraft had dealt with technical concerns before, including problems involving cabin heating and navigation equipment. During the final sector, the crew flew lower than planned, in part because of strong headwinds. Flying low can help in some conditions, but it also reduces margins. It can increase fuel strain and narrow recovery time. The last radio messages did not describe panic. They suggested an aircraft still working its way across a difficult ocean track. Then contact ended. A search found no confirmed wreckage. Investigators considered weather, navigation error, mechanical failure, and fuel issues. None could be proved cleanly. The official conclusion was essentially that the cause remained unknown. The deeper issue was not just one missing airplane. It was a system operating near the edge of what the route, the aircraft, and the era could safely absorb. The mainstream explanation is some combination of adverse weather, low-altitude flight, and technical trouble. A more historically informed interpretation says the Tudor already had a poor safety reputation, and the disappearance exposed how thin the margin for long Atlantic operations could be in the late 1940s. The speculative fringe points to the Bermuda Triangle because the final leg ended near Bermuda. But that adds atmosphere more than evidence. The real tension is more concrete. If the aircraft broke up, ditched badly, or drifted far from expected position, searchers may simply have been facing an ocean too large for the tools of the time. Sometimes a vanished flight does not point to one impossible event. It points to several ordinary failures aligning in exactly the wrong place. Number 8. Star Ariel. On January 17, 1949, another British South American Airways tutor disappears near Bermuda, and that fact alone is enough to make the case hard to ignore. Star Ariel leaves Bermuda for Kingston, Jamaica, carrying 20 people. The weather is reported as good. The aircraft climbs normally. The radio calls sound routine, then it vanishes. No distress signal, no confirmed wreckage. When a second aircraft from the same airline disappears in the same broad region within a year, people naturally look for one grand explanation. Here's the problem. The details do not line up cleanly enough to support one. Star Ariel was a Tudor Mark 4B, and the Tudor already had a troubled reputation. The captain, J.C. McPhee, was experienced. After departure from Bermuda, the crew reported climbing to around 18,000 feet. Then communication stopped. One frustrating detail is timing. There was no immediate alarm because radio conditions could be unreliable, and for a period the silence did not automatically mean disaster. That delayed the search response. By the time search efforts were moving, the possible area was enormous. The official investigation could not determine a cause. Sabotage was considered. Structural failure was considered. So was a sudden catastrophic event that gave the crew no time to transmit. But nothing could be proved. The mainstream explanation is still some form of abrupt mid-air failure or loss at sea. A more grounded reading is less dramatic and more unsettling. It says the post-war air system still had gaps that modern viewers underestimate. Aircraft reliability was uneven. Radio coverage was imperfect. Search doctrine was limited, and once a plane dropped into open water at speed, the ocean could erase the record almost immediately. The Bermuda Triangle version survives because the map location is irresistible. But the real issue is not supernatural geography. It is how little margin existed when long, overwater flying outran the technology meant to monitor it. Number 7. Stardust. In August 1947, a British South American Airways Avro Lancastrian named Stardust is descending towards Santiago after crossing the Andes from Buenos Aires. The crew sends one last Morse message. It contains a strange final word, Stendek. Then the aircraft disappears into the mountains. For decades, that word became the center of the mystery. It sounded like a code or a final clue from a cockpit in trouble. In reality, the deeper story is even more revealing. Sometimes a vanished flight is not hidden by myth. It is hidden by terrain. Stardust disappeared on August 2nd, 1947, with 11 people on board. The aircraft was flying through one of the most dangerous natural barriers in the world. The Andes create violent weather shifts, severe icing risk, and brutal navigation problems, especially in the 1940s. Pilots relied on dead reckoning, radio navigation, maps, timing, and visual assumptions that could become fatally wrong in cloud or strong winds. Investigators at the time suspected the plane had crashed high in the mountains, but they could not find it. Snowfall, avalanches, and glacial movement kept the wreck hidden. That absence of evidence made the Stendek message feel bigger than it really was. The case turned years later. In 1998, mountaineers near Mount Tupungato found engine remains and wreckage emerging from glacial ice. Recovery efforts confirmed it was stardust. The leading explanation became a navigation error caused in part by strong headwinds. The crew likely believed they had cleared the mountains and began descending too early. The plane then struck the mountain at high speed, and the glacier slowly entombed the wreck. That explanation solves the physical disappearance, but it also sharpens the larger thesis of this video. A flight can vanish for 50 years without any exotic cause at all. Mountain weather, bad position estimates, and moving eyes are enough. The fringe reading still obsesses over Stendeck as a coded secret, but the harder lesson is simpler. When geography is violent enough, the Earth can keep an air disaster hidden almost as effectively as the sea. Number 6. Glenn Miller's Norseman. On December 15, 1944, one of the most famous band leaders in America boarded a small military aircraft in England and vanished over the English Channel. Glenn Miller was traveling to France to prepare performances for Allied troops. That contrast is what makes the case stick. A celebrity disappears not over a remote ocean, but in one of the busiest war zones on Earth, and the record still refuses to close around one clear answer. The aircraft was a UC-64A Norseman flown by Flight Officer John Morgan. Also on board was Lieutenant Colonel Norman Basil. They left RAF Twinwood Farm in poor winter conditions. The channel in December meant cold air, icing risk, low visibility, and heavy military traffic. No confirmed distress call was received. No confirmed wreckage was recovered. That created a vacuum, and famous disappearances always pull speculation into a vacuum. The leading explanation has long been weather. The Norseman had a reputation for carburetor icing problems, and a small aircraft forced down into the channel during wartime might leave little recoverable evidence. That explanation works up to a point. One later claim said Miller's plane may have been struck by bombs jettisoned by returning Royal Air Force bombers that could not land safely with full loads. The theory gained attention because it seemed to explain both the suddenness and the lack of a distress call. But the evidence remains incomplete, and official records do not settle it. The fringe versions go further into espionage or assassination. The more sober reading is that war destroys data as efficiently as it destroys machines. Weather, traffic, and incomplete records can blur an air loss until no reconstruction feels fully satisfying. Number 5. Flight 19. On December 5, 1945, 5 U.S. Navy TBM Avenger torpedo bombers left Fort Lauderdale on a routine training mission and never returned. Then the aircraft sent to search for them vanished too. That double loss is why Flight 19 became one of the most durable aviation mysteries in American culture. It sounds like the setup for something paranormal. The real mechanism is more revealing. Navigation error, fuel burn, worsening weather, and command uncertainty were enough. The mission, known as Training Flight 19, was led by Lieutenant Charles Taylor, an experienced pilot who reportedly believed his compasses were malfunctioning. The planned route was a triangular overwater exercise east of Florida and back. Radio transmissions suggest Taylor became disoriented and thought the flight was over the Florida Keys rather than east of the Bahamas. That mistake mattered. If you think you are south of Florida when you are actually east of it, the direction that looks like safety can carry you farther out to sea. The radio traffic is the center of the case. Pilots in the group sounded unsure of position. Some believed they should head west. Taylor hesitated. Weather worsened as daylight faded. The Avengers eventually would have exhausted fuel and ditched in rough water. A Navy Martin PBM Mariner sent to search for them also disappeared. One likely explanation is that the PBM exploded in midair, since that aircraft type had a known reputation for dangerous fuel vapor fires. That detail often gets folded into one giant mystery, but it may have been a separate disaster linked only by timing. The mainstream explanation is strong here. Disorientation, instrument trouble, or perceived instrument trouble, worsening seas, fuel exhaustion, and difficult ditching conditions. A more historically grounded reading says the case became myth because the setting was perfect for myth. Military aircraft, patchy radio, multiple voices, and the Atlantic swallowing evidence. The Bermuda Triangle version came later because it was cleaner than the real story. But the real story is better. It shows that a vanished flight does not require impossible forces. It only requires trained men making wrong decisions in the wrong order, over water big enough to keep the final proof. Number 4. Amelia Earhart. On July 2, 1937, Amelia Earhart and navigator Fred Noonan took off from Lae, New Guinea, trying to reach tiny Howland Island in the Central Pacific. It was one of the most difficult legs of her around-the-world flight. The numbers alone explain why the case still grips people. They had to find a speck of land in a vast ocean after roughly 2,500 miles of flight, using radio navigation that was far less forgiving than the public often imagines. Then they vanished. Earhart was already one of the most famous women in the world, which is one reason the case never cooled. But fame did not make the route safer. Howland Island is small. Cloud cover, fuel burn, radio confusion, and directional error could all become fatal quickly. The cutter Itasca, stationed near Howland to assist, received transmissions that suggested Earhart was close but could not see the island. One of the most quoted lines was that she was on the line 157-337 and would repeat the message. That sounds specific. It also shows the problem. A line of position can still leave a huge search space if contact fails at the wrong moment. Search aircraft and ships were deployed afterward, but the Pacific gave them almost nothing useful to work with. The mainstream explanation remains that Earhart and Noonan missed Howland, ran low on fuel, and crashed into the Pacific. That is still the leading view because it fits the fuel problem, the radio record, and the basic geometry of the flight. A more historically informed reinterpretation argues they may have landed elsewhere, most famously around Nikomaroro, and survived for some period before dying there. That theory has driven repeated searches and artifact debates, but no find has ended the case conclusively. The fringe versions go further into capture, secret missions, or official cover-up. Those claims survive mostly because the wreck has never been found. Here's why this case belongs in this video. Earhart did not vanish because the sky opened and swallowed her. She vanished because long-range navigation in 1937 left almost no room for small errors. Once radio coordination broke down, one of the most famous flights in history became a blind search over a giant ocean. Fame could not solve that. It only made the silence louder. Number 3. Air France Flight 447. On June 1st, 2009, an Airbus A330 carrying 228 people from Rio de Janeiro to Paris disappeared over the Atlantic in the middle of the night. For a time, it looked as if a modern airliner had simply dropped out of the world. That is what makes Flight 447 such an important step in the pattern. Even in the digital age, an aircraft lost over deep water can become shockingly hard to reconstruct. The flight encountered convective weather over the equatorial Atlantic. At cruise altitude, ice crystals obstructed the pitot tubes, which fed airspeed data to the cockpit systems. The autopilot disconnected. Confusing instrument indications followed. In the minutes that mattered most, the crew made control inputs that put the aircraft into a stall from which it never recovered. That chain is now well documented, but it was not clear at the time. The debris field was hard to interpret. The ocean floor search was difficult, expensive, and slow. The flight recorders were not recovered until nearly 2 years later. That delay matters because it shows how even a case that is eventually solved can spend months or years looking almost impossible. The mainstream explanation is strong: high-altitude icing of sensors, automation dropout, loss of situational awareness, and sustained stall. A broader reading is even more important. Flight 447 exposed the gap between what the public thinks modern aviation can instantly explain and what the ocean still refuses to give back on command. When a jet crashes into deep water at night and the position data is incomplete, even a 21st century investigation can begin in near darkness. That problem will matter even more in the next case. Number 2. Pan Am Flight 7. On November 8, 1957, a Boeing 377 Stratocruiser named Clipper Romance was flying from San Francisco toward Honolulu with 44 people on board. In the early hours over the Pacific, the crew reported engine trouble and turned back. They were still in radio contact. Then the aircraft disappeared before a controlled ditching could be completed. What makes the case linger is not that no one knew anything. It is that investigators knew enough to sketch the emergency, but not enough to close the final seconds with confidence. Pan Am Flight 7 had already traveled hundreds of miles west of California when the crew reported that one engine had oversped and that they were shutting it down. The aircraft then began returning east. Later calls indicated that a second engine was also giving trouble. At that point, the plan shifted toward ditching at sea after daylight. The cutter Pontchartrain was directed toward the expected area. Radio communication continued for hours. Then it stopped. Search aircraft and ships later found an oiled slick and some floating debris, but no survivors and no intact wreckage. The official investigation concluded that the most likely cause was a loss of control after a series of engine and propeller malfunctions, possibly worsened by crew fatigue and the aerodynamic penalties of a damaged piston airliner trying to remain stable over open ocean. That explanation matters because it shows how a flight can leave a trail of technical clues and still end in uncertainty if the aircraft goes down in deep water before rescue forces arrive. A more historically informed reading says the Stratocruiser was a complicated long-range aircraft with a mixed safety record, and overwater operations in the 1950s still gave crews little margin once cascading mechanical problems began. The speculative fringe has occasionally reached for sabotage, but the evidence does not support that. The Pacific turned a partly visible emergency into a permanently incomplete one. Number 1. Malaysia Airlines Flight MH370. Just after midnight on March 8, 2014, a Boeing 777 left Kuala Lumpur for Beijing carrying 239 people. Less than an hour later, near the waypoint IGARI, the aircraft stopped communicating with civilian air traffic control. What followed made it one of the most consequential disappearances in aviation history. The transponder went silent. Military radar later indicated that the aircraft had turned back across the Malay Peninsula. Satellite handshakes suggested it continued flying for hours into the southern Indian Ocean. A wide-body jet in the age of global data had not simply crashed. It had slipped out of the normal tracking picture and kept moving. MH370 is the strongest final case because it gathers almost every pattern in this video into one event. There was no immediate mayday. Early assumptions about the route were wrong. The search area changed dramatically as new data was interpreted. Ocean scale overwhelmed confidence, and every missing piece created room for competing narratives. The multinational search became one of the largest and most expensive in aviation history. Surface searches covered huge stretches of sea. Deep ocean sonar operations mapped remote seafloor. Debris later found on beaches such as Réunion and along the East African coast confirmed that the aircraft had ended in the Indian Ocean, but the main wreckage field was not conclusively located. The mainstream explanation is that someone in the cockpit diverted the aircraft and that it ultimately ran out of fuel over the southern Indian Ocean. That is the leading view because it fits the turnback, the satellite data, and the drift analysis of recovered debris. But even that leaves hard edges. The final descent profile is still debated. Motive remains uncertain. The exact resting place remains unconfirmed. A broader historical reading matters more than any one suspect theory. MH370 exposed how modern aviation still depended on systems that were not designed to provide continuous, tamper-proof global tracking under every condition. The speculative fringe reaches toward hijacking plots, interception, or stranger ideas, but the enduring force of the case comes from something more concrete. In 2014, the world discovered that an advanced airliner could still vanish into the blind geometry of ocean, distance, and delayed interpretation. That is the larger lesson of every case in this countdown. The flights did not disappear because the laws of physics failed. They disappeared because physics, geography, weather, machinery, human judgment, and search limitations combined faster than certainty could keep up. Sometimes the gap was a wrong heading. Sometimes it was mountain ice. Sometimes it was war. Sometimes it was a silent turn over black water. The pattern is not that these flights are beyond explanation. It is that the final explanation keeps breaking against missing evidence. And once the evidence falls into deep ocean, remote terrain, or chaotic airspace, even famous names, huge searches, and modern technology may only narrow the mystery. They may not end it.